So in this module, we're going to talk about the general provisions and applicability of cost principles. I know you guys don't do indirect cost, but we're going to get into some indirect cost discussion here. Do your MPOs claim indirect cost? Yeah. Okay, so having a good understanding of indirect cost that would apply to them is helpful. Understanding the composition of cost. Now this, we're going to talk about indirect cost, but cost in general across everything you do, this is applicable to that. Understanding the requirements for claiming indirect costs, and then identifying certain selected items of cost and their allowability principles. So this is where we get into some fairly interesting conversations at times. What's allowable, what's not allowable. We'll see what you guys come up with this time. So this is found in 2 CFR 200 Subpart E. Starts with a general description and definition of what cost is. So non-federal entities are responsible for administrating federal funds efficiently and effectively, complying with programmatic requirements and other terms of the federal award, supporting costs charged with adequate supporting documentation. You're going to hear us talk, Bob's going to do the second half of this module, but you'll hear us talk throughout documentation, documentation, documentation. It's really important to support your costs as you're making your claims. You can never have too much documentation. And then not earning or keeping any profit unless you're authorized. There's a special note here, the policy guide that explains that in reviewing, negotiating, and approving indirect costs, so IC is indirect cost proposals, the cognizant agency is charged with generally assuring that the non-federal entity is applying the cost principle on a consistent basis. So what that means, boiled down in a nutshell, is you can't use one cost method or rate for federal highway funds and a different cost method or rate for your DHS funds. It has to be the same across all federal funding. It's what that principle is saying. All right, so the basic composition, I told you yesterday I am not smarter than a 5th grader, but I do understand generally basic formulas like this. It's pretty straightforward. Your total cost is your direct cost, your allowable costs, plus your indirect costs, those that are allocable to your program, minus any credits. So pretty straightforward. Your direct costs, so that's the cost that is directly attributable to a project, your indirect costs that we're going to get to here in a minute, and then any credits that you may have received. That's the total cost of your project. But I do work for the federal government, so sometimes 2 plus 2 minus 4 equals 8. All right, so allowability of cost. In order to determine allowability of a cost that's being charged, these factors have to be identified and applicable. So we're going to walk through each one individually, but it has to be reasonable. If a person on the street walked in, would they say that the cost for the computer that you just bought is reasonable? If it is not a super scientific, if it's just a Microsoft Surface Pro, or I don't know, a Dell or whatever you have, iPad, if it's a $10,000 computer, is that reasonable for a Surface Pro or an iPad? Most likely not. It's not a reasonable cost. So it's got to be reasonable. It's got to be allocable. Can I put it to a specific project? If I can't tell you which project it's for, it's not allocable. It has to be authorized. Again, consistent. Is it consistent across everything that you're doing? Not charging one amount to one project and another amount to another project. It's in accordance with the generally accepted accounting principles. You're not duplicating it. We're not charging project A for it and project B. And then the net applicable credits are applied. And then you'll see again, adequately documented. So what is a reasonable cost? As we said, it's ordinary, necessary. You need to incur this cost in order to be able to do your work. An example of this might be you have a finance person coming on board. You need the finance person for project A, but you're going to charge project B for it as well. Project B didn't need an extra finance person. They only needed it on project A. So is that a necessary cost for project B? Not necessarily, not really. The restraints and requirements. Are you working within the confines of general business practices when you're procuring your item? Are you staying within your laws and specifications? Market prices, again, compatible to other industries. So are you being charged $20,000 for a computer, but your coworker in FRA is only being charged $5,000? They have to be relatively the same. You're paying market prices. You're not paying exorbitant amounts because somebody said, oh, there's federal funds on this, so the Fed's got plenty of money. Let's charge all the expenses to that and jack up the prices. Okay? And then prudent acts, and then the costs are incurred using the established practices. So we talked about, Bob just went through the whole contracting methods and how we do things and what we're doing, following your state standards. Allocable costs, this is where we're talking. So 2 CFR 200.405 defines allocable cost as a cost that is allocable to a particular federal award or other cost objective if the goods or services involved are chargeable or assignable to that federal award or cost objective in accordance with relative benefits received. That's a whole lot of words to say. Basically, do you have a cost-benefit relationship? Can you directly tie that cost to that project? It's pretty straightforward when you think about it that way without all the extra words. The activities that are benefit from the indirect cost have to receive the appropriate amount. So if you're spreading across multiple projects, Project A best way to take this is, again, to that finance person. Project A, the finance person spent 2 hours working on it. Project B, they spent 5. Project C, they spent 8. You're clearly documenting how much time was spent on each project, and you're giving the appropriate amount to that project. Your charge, your cost is. Does that make sense so far? Cost shifting is not allowed. You can't say, okay, well, Project B has $50,000 remaining. Project A only has $10,000. I've got a $60,000 bill. So even though they worked the majority of the hours on Project A, I'm going to charge the cost to Project B. Does that make sense with everybody? Okay. And then most importantly, if you're going to claim indirect cost, or if your MPOs are going to claim indirect cost, there has to be a cost allocation plan approved prior to incurring the cost. So it clearly documents your plan for how you're going to allocate the charges. It's got a plan for how the rate you're going to charge. It's very specific, and we're going to get into some of that in a little bit, but it's very specific in the plan, and it has to be approved. In this case, for indirect costs, will be approved by ODOT moving forward. Okay, applicable credits. Anybody have credits? What kind of credits do you have? Can you think of credits you might? Toll credits? Okay, what other kind of credits? Credit cards? Yeah. Some of those could get pretty interesting if you start using them to buy a couch or something. Leavenworth is the federal prison. I'm not sure where you guys go. In-kind credit? What other kind of credits might you guys have? Think on a project. What kind of project credits do you get? Okay, I'll help you out. What about purchase discounts? Can somebody give me an example of a purchase discount? No? So if you buy 20 million tons of aggregate, I don't know if that's a reasonable amount of aggregate, but sounds good. 20 million tons of aggregate will give you 50% off. That's a discount credit, right? If we do the work, we win the bid on 10 bridges, we'll give you a 20% discount as opposed to doing just one bridge, right? So you've got those kinds of credits. What about insurance refunds? Anybody have to deal with an insurance refund? Piece of equipment gets damaged, you file an insurance claim, the insurance company pays you for it. Okay, so insurance refunds, indemnities, overpayment, adjustments of overpayment. Maybe you got charged, you paid the contractor too much, you got a refund from the contractor. That all goes back. So we talked about your total cost being the direct costs, the indirect costs, and the credits. So the credits have to be paid back to Federal Highway on federal awards. So you want to make sure that the amount received by the federal government to finance activities or services service operations of the non-federal entity should be treated as applicable credit. So we get our fair share back. All right, here's really important. Nobody wants a gotcha moment. So if you're not sure on a cost, it's a really good idea to just talk to your division office. Make sure before you incur the cost, this is really important, before you incur the cost, not after, you're getting permission from the division. Ask them. Contact your division. Say, well, hey, we got this cost coming. We think it's a little different. We're not quite sure. We're not sure we can allocate it directly to the project, or something that comes just a little unusual. Getting permission ahead of time is a really good idea. Because what you don't want to have happen is a collection of unallowable costs. I had this happen last year with a few of the divisions and state DOTs with whom we work on our OJT Supportive Services program. I started to talk yesterday about the National Summer Transportation Institute and the fact that we couldn't get the funding to them, to the states, until it was July, August timeframe by the time we got the money. Well, the programs run June to August, as we said. There were 11 states that had this. They undertook their project hoping they were going to get the money. Only one state actually did an AC. We talked about AC yesterday, right? Advanced construction, knowing or hoping that you're going to get the federal funds coming, but you're not quite sure yet. So one state out of 11 did an AC of their project. The remaining 10 states had incurred costs, had tried to invoice for those costs, and they were unallowable because they did not have a project in place prior to incurring the costs. So all of those payments were unallowable and had to be returned to the federal government. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention, your costs are allowable. Determination could be made that they're unallowable by the federal awarding agency. So in this case, Federal Highway, we made that determination that the way they ran their program just wasn't right. It was improperly obligated, improper payment. The cognizant agency for an indirect cost plan could make that, or the pass-through entity. In this case, you guys, working with your LPA or your MPO, you can make that determination as you're looking through their records. So the refund has to be made to the federal government, and most importantly, it could incur interest. So you want to be very careful with those. All right, so I know Oklahoma doesn't claim indirect cost, but let's get into some examples of what they could be. It's pretty straightforward. Direct costs can be traced directly to a cost object, such as a federal award or project. Who can give me a direct cost, do you think? Steel if you bought it in America, right? Right, so direct material would be one. What's that? Direct labor. So they're specifically working on that project. They're not working across multiple projects. One project, correct. Direct labor. Oh. Wrong way. Here we go. Okay. Oh, it all came up. I thought they flew in. I apologize. Equipment. Travel that is directly associated, again, with one project. If you're an area engineer and you're going to project A to project B to project C in one day, that's not necessarily directly attributable to one project. And then contracts. You're contracted to build the project executed. All right, who can give me examples of indirect cost? What might that be? Office supplies, computers. What else? This isn't a gotcha moment either. Admin services, yeah. What else? Depreciation. Oh, you're reading your list. Cheating. That doesn't work, you're right. Here I'm thinking, wow, this is a really smart audience. Another blonde moment for me. It's a good thing I can really laugh at myself. Oh my goodness. Expenses, general administrative expenses. So my job in headquarters in Federal Highway, we tried this a few years ago. Gosh, it's been actually more than a few, like 15 years ago. They tried to, and FedLands does it, but headquarters really struggled with trying to tie our time to specific projects. So in my office, in the Office of Infrastructure, I support the Office of Bridges and Structures, which has structures, it has geotech, it has hydraulics, it has steel bridges and concrete bridges, and any other thing the bridge guy can think of that we've got. And then I support the pavements office, which has materials, and it has pavement design, and it has performance and pavement management. And so I oversee all their contracts. I oversee their financing. So trying to put my time specifically to one project was almost virtually impossible. You know, I spent 10 minutes here sorting out a question on the contract. I spent 20 minutes over here issuing a financial document for them. So for us, it didn't work really well. So with indirect costs, you have to be able to, it would become an indirect cost. It can't attribute it to one project. I'm just supported in general overhead. It's our general operating expenses, how my salary gets paid. I don't get paid. Some of our federal lands family, they get paid specifically by project with project dollars. So I'm general expense. So I'm an indirect cost, if you think of it that way. Other direct costs, when we talk about, let me back up just a minute. When we talk about facilities, so we talked about the supplies and the printers, things like that. Those would be an indirect cost. Major repairs, and I think I might get into this a little bit too. Major repairs like a new roof on your facility, that's a capital improvement. That would not be an indirect cost. All right, so we talked about the indirect costs. There has to be an indirect cost rate that is established prior to collecting any indirect costs. The plan and the indirect cost proposal has to be approved prior. We talked about that. And then the rate that is decided, generally there's a formula. Some who, though, have never had a negotiated rate or received less than $35 million in federal awards use what they call a de minimis rate, and we're going to get into that in a few slides. But it's a set rate of 10%. So this would be, it's more for the local agencies. They're not going to spend a lot of time getting those rates or have the history to do it. So you can see here, if an entity neither elects the 10% de minimis rate nor submits a certified rate or plan proposal, the federal government may either disallow all indirect costs or unilaterally establish a plan or rate. But as we've talked about repeatedly over the last day or so, the indirect costs, ODOT doesn't collect it, so it's completely voluntary. We don't dictate whether you do it or not. Okay, required certifications. 2 CFR 200 Subpart E requires certifications annually. 2 of them, that expenditures are proper and in accordance with terms and conditions of the award and signed by an authorized official. And then the indirect cost plan has to be approved as well. That it's following the uniform guidance and is applicable to all federal awards, not just one or the other. All right, now we're going to get into some conversation about selected items of cost. And remember, the costs we talked about on the very first slide, they have to be reasonable, necessary, allocable. You have to consider your credits, and they have to be authorized. So in the next few slides, we're going to get into some of the lists of selected items of cost. It's not exhaustive. There are a lot of things that you guys encounter on a regular basis, so you may or may not see them on the next few slides. If you have questions, we'll do our best to answer them or put them in a parking lot and get back to you. But these considerations apply whether the item is for a direct or indirect, and that based on the treatment of similar items of cost. All right, so that's kind of the caveat moving into the next couple of slides. So this is a general list of selected items of cost. These are the things that we typically run into in the day-to-day functioning of a DOT or federal highway, federal lands, that we're going to start looking at in specific. So we'll start with advertising. Generally, on the left, you're going to see generally allowed, and on the right, you're going to see not allowed. So recruitment of personnel, procurement of goods and services, disposal of scrap or surplus, program outreach for federal award, and cost of communicating with public and press. So those items of cost would be allowed for reimbursement with federal dollars. Not allowed would be the cost of meetings, conventions related to other activities of the entity, there is an exception to this. Correct me if I'm wrong, Bob. But if it's a training event, as Bob talked about earlier, you could use your funds if it's workforce development. So that would be the one difference between meeting or commit. It's not really a convention, but sometimes meetings can be confused for training. Salaries and wages of employees engaged in setting up and displaying exhibits, making presentations, and briefings. So you can't pay a stipend to somebody to come make a presentation at an event for you using federal dollars. Cost of promotional items, memorabilia, gifts, and souvenirs. So all the little trinkets that our kids love to go. How many have kids that you take to like a home show, or have you ever been? I know some of you have really little kids and some of you have older kids, but my kids love it when we go to like a home show and they've got all those little trinkets, the pencils here and a bag there. So all those things can't be used can't pay with federal funds. Fun to have, but you can't use federal funds for it. And cost of advertising and public relations designed solely to promote the non-federal entity. So if it's only going to benefit ODOT, then it can't use federal highway funds. All right, unfortunately, not allowed ever. Never allowed to have alcohol supported with federal funds. There is one exception to that rule at the federal highway level. It's for our International Programs Office. They are the only office in the Federal Highway Administration that is allowed to buy alcohol, and that's because they do a lot of cross meetings, peer exchanges with officials from other countries, where yeah, it's pretty interesting. I had when I first joined Federal Highway, I worked in our Office of International Programs, and my responsibility was as the International Visitors Coordinator. Fancy title. Basically, I planned meetings for international visitors, and I had a meeting with some Japanese, and they were coming to the U.S. We were touring Utah. They had just finished the Olympic. We'd just gone through the Winter Olympics, and we were looking at all of their ITS, and it's great meeting up in Utah. And the Japanese were hosting a dinner that I was supposed to plan on their behalf, and they wanted wine. I don't drink very often. To me, $15, $30 for a bottle of wine, like that's pretty expensive. So I got middle of the road, like $30 bottles of wine, and the Japanese took one sip and sent it all back and ordered what they wanted. At the end of the night, we ended up with a $1,200 bill for wine. Their bill, not ours. We're not allowed to buy alcohol. So all that to say that. Well, I don't drink, so I don't know. I guess it was. They enjoyed it. All right, so compensation for personal services. Wrong button. All right. It's allowed if it's reasonable, consistent, and allocable to the federal award. So you have to make the direct tie to the federal award if you're going to look for compensation of personal services. It has to be based on records accurately reflecting work performed. So that could be a time card or diary, an engineer's journal, something like that. But again, we go back to what I said when we first started, documentation, really important. Blended funding, you could use both federal and DOT funding for that. Hiring of employees according to the entity's policies and meets applicable federal requirements. So budget estimates, interim accounting purposes, only not allowed. Fringe benefits, we talked about that a little bit earlier. Again, they have to be reasonable. You can't say, wow, I really like John Smith. He's coming. We'll just make sure that he's got everything. He's got the Cadillac package for him. We really want to recruit him. It has to be reasonable for everybody. Benefits are provided for under a written policy. Again, John Smith can't have 10 weeks of leave because he's so amazing, and Susie Jones only gets 4. It has to be, you have a policy that has the equitable across the board. The costs are equitably allocated. If he's working on 5 projects, we're taking into account across those 5 projects. And then accounting basis selected for costing each type is consistent. Questions so far on what's allowable, not allowable? No wine. Yes?
MPOs and meetings. Sometimes MPOs conduct meetings in locations where it may be necessary to pay for facility. And in some instances, that facility comes
Mm-hmm.
Is that, I think there has been some
Mm-hmm.
reading that on certain occasions that meal is allowed, in some instances it's not.
Good question. So the question about food and meetings, we're going to get to that in just a minute. Okay? So we're looking at defense and prosecution. Legal expenses required for the administration of a federal award is allowed. You can't use federal dollars to sue the federal government. Generally not allowed. Might be frowned upon. Just saying. So not allowed. Costs for the defense in civil or criminal proceedings are also unallowable. That would be personal expenses. All right, entertainment. Costs for entertainment are unallowable except with a programmatic purpose and authorized by the federal awarding agency. So this applies to Federal Highway as well in headquarters. We have the same rule. I'm not allowed to provide food for a meeting. It's the same rule. It's not allowed. Except, and this is where it's important, it depends. The answer is it depends on the meeting. So if the meeting is, for example, maybe on a tribal reservation in the middle of nowhere, and there's nowhere to get food, because that's often the case with reservations in particular. You might have to drive an hour to get to food, and I'm sorry? Well, let's pretend this one doesn't. You're right, they do though. But they may not, and you have to go an hour, and you're having a meeting there for whatever reason, and then there's just no reasonable way to get food to people. You could provide food in that case with, and it's the second point there, authorized prior approval. You would not want to incur that cost without prior approval. Happens with us as well. I have a contract where we had to pay, the contractor paid for food in, we were actually in Irvine, California. But the facility we were in, they required that the food be charged. We had to buy it from them. And it really, where the facility was in Irvine, it would have meant probably a 2-hour lunch break to get everybody out and back. And it was a one-day meeting, so it wasn't a great use of time or the expenses there. So we had to run it through our chief counsel's department and get its prior approval before incurring the cost. So I would say to you, Isaac, it depends. And I would get all the specifics and run it through chief counsel for you.
The MPO is renting the facility, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
and that cost is included in that facility rental for the meeting. Is that an allowable cost?
You would have to show that there are no other option for any other meeting anywhere in that area. So if you've got 4 hotels in the area and you picked the Hyatt Regency because you really like the Hyatt and you've got all your points with Hyatt and you want to have the meeting there, but the Marriott or the Comfort Inn or maybe in this case the Motel 6 provides meeting space for you without having to incur food costs, then I would say that would not be an allowable expense. Bob, feel free to jump in, but he's talking specifically to food. That the meeting location is requiring that they purchase food.
So usually if food's part of the registration fee, then we call it registration. But if food is provided, then people can't claim that food on like travel. What I want to say. Hello, Ted. Okay. So basically on food, I would never allow food to be purchased unless it's for a public meeting where the intent to provide the food is an incentive for the public to come in and give you comments. That's really the only time that we allow food unless it's like in a conference or a training session or in travel. Those options allow food. If you go to the travel section, it says, yeah, we're going to pay for per diem or we're going to pay for your meals when you're in travel status. But we should never use federal dollars for food. Did you read what it says in appropriations law on the notes? Because basically what the appropriations lawyers say is, and if you don't have it, I have it on my tablet here.
I have it.
Okay. Because we have very specific requirements on food. Do you care if I do it real quick?
No, please. Okay.
So basically, what we're saying is for a public meeting and planning, that's really the only time I've seen it. Now, I've been asked, hey, we have MPO meetings, and it's open to the public can come, but the intent of the meeting is for the MPO to have a meeting, an internal meeting, and they want to, provide food for their MPO members. That is not an allowable cost. That would be an improper payment, and we cannot participate in purchasing food for the MPO members. Even if the meeting is open to the public, the intent is not to get public comment. The intent is, hey, it's open to the public, they can come and listen. But if you're actually having a public meeting where you want feedback from the public and you want to buy light refreshments in the morning, or you want to do a pizza over a lunch break, and that's to help entice people to come to the meeting and provide comments, then that's really the only time we would allow food. And this is the reason why, is because appropriations law, which is the law of the land when it comes to federal appropriations, basically says that entertainment is an umbrella term that includes food and drink, either as formal meals or snacks or refreshments. Entertainment expenses are generally not allowable in the selected items of cost, and in the specific Volume 1, Chapter 4 of Appropriations Law, it says, the basis for the rule is that entertainment is essentially a personal expense, even where it occurs in some business-related context. Except where specifically appropriated for, entertainment cannot normally be said to be necessary to carry out the purposes of an appropriation. So, is it necessary for us to buy the MPO board members lunch? It's not necessary. There's no reason to do that. So then in your example, if we were going to have a meeting at a hotel or somewhere, and that meeting is just to have a meeting, food should not even be in the cost at all. If they want to provide food, if the MPO wants to provide food, if the state DOT wants to provide food, we're not saying that food can't be provided. We're just saying it is not necessary for the federal dollars to participate in that food, so it is not going to be something that we would normally allow, unless it's in that public meeting, very specific, wanting to get public feedback from the public. Then you can do light refreshments, some like reasonable type of a thing. You can't say, hey, we want the public to come and we're going to do a filet mignon lunch. That would not be reasonable. But you could do a pizza lunch or something like that. Does that make sense?
They have used facility cost of facility as a basis, and I'm not in the finance business, so I don't know whether they're separating, making it look where their match, they're using their own funds to pay for that, and federal funds are not involved. But I know that the way they've couched it is as facility.
Yeah, here's the thing on match. Even if they're buying it with state dollars or local dollars or MPO dollars, and they're saying, hey, we're going to pay for these costs, and their foods included in that, and we're going to pay for those with MPO dollars, you cannot use that as match. Because remember when we talked about allowable costs, or we're talking about allowable costs, that match is part of the overall federal project. So even if they're spent with 100% state or local dollars, it's still part of the federal project. And so those costs would still be unallowable. They would have to be completely excluded. They could still incur the cost, but they could not be included as part of the total cost of the project. Yeah.
Yep. You're welcome. I've run across this too myself. I've had contractors get pretty sneaky in how they try to invoice us, where it comes as a facility cost, and I'm like, oh, the facility really cost $10,000? Why is that? So it's a good question. Other questions on entertainment. This one is really the catch-all caveat of most of what we do. Everybody's really hungry. It's 11:13. All right, one more, guys. Hang in there with me. All right. Maintenance and repair costs necessary to keep buildings and equipment in efficient operating condition are allowable. So things like insurance that you have to provide over the facility, security. You have a security guard sitting at your front desk. That would be an allowable cost. Things like we talked about the roof being put on, which is adding to the permanent value of the building, or appreciably prolonging the life, is a capital expenditure and would not be allowed. And then travel. So this is one kind of like where we were with food. Travel. Official travel expenses are allowable. One of the things I see nowadays that people like to try to claim are seat upgrades. They don't want to sit by the toilet. They want to sit in not even first class, just kind of that business seat class. That would not be an allowable cost. I've seen people try to charge us for the Southwest early bird check-in. They want to be able to get in boarding group A, and so they want to pay that extra $20, and they try to charge it back to us. General rule of thumb is if it's not in the best interest of the government, it's not allowable. So charges must be consistent with the entity's non-federal program. So we talked about this yesterday, the hierarchy of law. It's either federal travel regulations or a more restrictive state procedure that's in place. And then it has to be in writing. Question on travel expenses. I've seen just about everything. I had a traveler one time rent a vehicle. He was unauthorized to rent, so we backed him in. We're like, okay, well, we'll forgive him this time. We backed him in. Well, there was a storm that came through with hail, and his car was totaled, and we couldn't pay him a dime for it. So it was personal expense because he did not go through our procedures to do it. So
We'll finish up Subpart E, this module, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Laura, and she's going to take the next module, which is going to be on single audit, and then we'll talk about federal highway oversight and stewardship activities. So we covered a lot of these, but are there any other selected items of cost that you might see a cost come across your desk that you have a question on? We covered a few of these, but if you do have any other ones that you'd like to talk about or you'd like to ask a question about, now's the chance to, let's look them up, and we can, I can tell you a little bit about them, or we can go out to 2 CFR 200 and kind of drill down and look at if it's allowable or not. Anybody have any of these that you'd like to talk about? Other than the ones that we talked about already? No? Okay. So just remember, if you do have a question on a cost, you can go out to 2 CFR 200 and see if you can find whether it's allowable or not. A lot of these slides have basic information, like when we talked about the compensation here. There's just a few bullets on the screen, but if you actually go into that section of 2 CFR 200, it's very comprehensive, it's very detailed, and it gives you a whole bunch of different scenarios. When we talk about compensation fringe benefits, there are many different types of fringe benefits that you could provide. Like it might talk about, hey, a vehicle that's provided to an employee, like maybe say a director of a DOT gets a vehicle that they get to use as a fringe benefit. Are those costs allowable? And it'll tell you when they're allowable, when they're not allowable. If it's used for just business purposes, it's allowable. If it's used for business and personal, then there has to be some tracking going on. So it'll really go down into the details of that. So I highly recommend, if you have questions on any type of a cost item on whether it's allowable or not, come out here to the selected items of cost and you can drill down and find it. And if you can't find it, that's where we say, hey, go back up to the division, get prior approval, ask them to see if they can give you a determination. And as long as you do that and you get that prior approval, then if it comes up in an audit finding later, you can document that you asked permission and you got the okay from the feds, and it probably wouldn't be an issue. So let's talk about now allocability again. So Laura talked about it earlier, kind of an introduction to making sure that there's a cost-benefit relationship between the cost and the cost item that you're charging it to, whether it's a project or a work program activity. There has to be a cost benefit. So a cost is allocable to a particular federal award if it is incurred specifically for that award. So that means those would be direct costs. The middle part there both benefits the federal award and other work of the non-federal entity and can be distributed in proportions that may be used using reasonable methods. That could also be a direct cost, and that's where the example I would give would be like an equipment rate. You have a piece of equipment, you're going to use it on many different projects, but you can charge those directly. You can charge those costs directly to a project. Fringe benefits is another good example here. Fringe benefits, sometimes states will dump all their fringe benefits into an indirect cost allocation plan and bill it that way, but oftentimes most states like you, if you don't claim indirect cost, you still have a fringe benefit rate or a labor additive rate that you can charge directly to projects. And then that third one is it's necessary for the overall operation, and it is assignable to the part of the federal award in accordance with 2 CFR. That's going to be your indirect costs, and the allocation method for that generally is going to be an indirect cost rate. So what is an indirect cost again? It's a cost where the costs benefit many different objectives of the agency. So it could be direct objectives plus indirect objectives, and they're incurred for common or joint purposes. These costs benefit more than one cost objective, so you can't specifically assign them to a project. When we talk about cost objective in 2 CFR 200, we're talking about a project in Federal Highway Administration. So we can't identify the cost specifically to one cost objective or one project, so we have to spread that cost across all of your projects. And that's what we do when we have an indirect cost allocation. And notice down there it says with a particular final cost objective without effort disproportionate to the results achieved. That's what my example, kind of my extreme example, if you want to identify every cost as a direct cost, you could. But you would have to go into that box of paper and say every single piece of paper is valued at this based on the total cost of the box, and then you can allocate those directly if you wanted to do that, but that would be disproportionate effort. It would be you'd spend way much more probably money and time and resources accounting for that than just dumping the entire cost of that into an indirect cost pool and billing it that way. So indirect costs, we normally allow you to bill us indirect costs using an indirect cost rate. There is one other method. It's called a narrative cost allocation methodology. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But that is writing an actual methodology document that tells how you're going to distribute those indirect costs across, say, a program. And most of the time we don't see a narrative for your entire indirect costs. We see them for special circumstances like major projects, or like in Vermont, they had an ER event, and they basically were able to identify all of the indirect costs that supported that ER event, but they didn't develop an indirect cost allocation plan. They said, okay, our total ER event was $10 million. We had 5 projects that were for this ER event, each one having a different piece of that $10 million. And they figured out what the ratio of each project was. So let's say $2.5 million of the $10 million project, they would distribute the indirect cost to that project at that 25% rate. And that's basically how it works. So you can just write a methodology document on how you're going to do it. But that's usually on special circumstances, special projects, or ER events, that kind of thing. For regular programmatic type of indirect cost allocation, you should have an ICAP and you should get an approved rate. So everything that you need to know about indirect costs, if you do choose to claim indirect costs in the future, for state, local governments, and Indian tribal governments, we use Appendix 7 of 2 CFR 200. And that basically tells us how you develop that indirect cost allocation plan. And we're going to go through a couple little terms and definitions really fast. So when you develop an indirect cost rate, you have to have a direct cost base, and you have to have all of your indirect costs. So you basically divide your indirect costs by the direct cost base to come up with your percentage. So your base is either total direct costs, or it could be just direct salaries and wages, or it could be some other mix of direct costs. And it's really up to the non-federal entity to decide what their base is going to be, but you need to look at that base and figure out what's going to be the best thing for you. If you have, let's say, all of your contracting for federal projects is contractors, but all of your state project contracting is done by state forces, it would not make sense to use a direct salaries and wages base for your indirect costs, because we're only going to be billing the state projects for the indirect costs, because you don't really have a whole lot of state forces working on a federal project. So it makes more sense that you would use a total direct cost base. But if your state and federal program equally benefit from state forces, then it would make sense to use a direct salaries and wages base. So you have to kind of do that analysis in the very beginning to figure out how you're going to develop your rate. The base period, that's going to be most of the time your fiscal period, your fiscal year. Cost objective, that's the project. These are all terms out of 2 CFR 200, so we have to kind of figure out what does it mean for federal highway. So cost objective is a project. Cognizant agency, that's very specifically talking about cognizant agency for indirect cost, which for DOTs, state DOTs, is Federal Highway Administration. So we're going to approve, if you do claim indirect costs, we're going to approve that indirect cost plan each year or however often you submit it to us. The indirect cost pool is basically your total indirect cost. All of the indirect costs that you've identified is your indirect cost pool. And then the indirect cost rate is your indirect cost pool divided by your direct cost base, whichever one you choose, and that's how you come up with the percentage or the rate. Then remember, whatever your base is, when you develop your rate, that's the only way that you can charge your indirect costs. You can't say we're going to develop our rate based on direct salaries and wages, and then we're going to charge that rate to all of your direct costs. That would be an improper charge, and you would actually recoup or get more indirect costs reimbursed than what you actually incurred. So it's really important that you maintain consistency on the way you developed it is the way you have to apply it exactly. Then that indirect cost rate proposal is basically all of the supporting documentation that supports your numbers. So a lot of times those indirect cost rate proposals can be really big and thick, just like a big old phone book, and it has all of your financial documents. It has, you know, every single methodology on how you came up with allocation methods for your indirect departments in your organization. So it has to document everything on how you came up with that percentage rate and how you came up with your methodology for charging indirect costs. You also have to show, because some unallowables can only be billed as or could possibly be billed as an indirect, but they still would not be allowable. So you have to be able to exclude unallowables from both your direct cost pool and your indirect cost pool. Then we have what's called the Central Services Cost Allocation Plan. Most all states have this. It is approved by HHS, and it's usually submitted up to HHS from the overall state government. So the state of Oklahoma will basically develop this Central Services Cost Allocation Plan, and they send it up to HHS for approval. And what it is they will identify, okay, the state auditor, the Oklahoma state auditor, the Oklahoma State Treasurer's Office, they provide services to all of the other state departments. They process, like the Treasurer's Office processes the payments for the state DOT. The auditor's office probably is involved with doing the single audit for the state DOT. So they come up with this billing method because they charge you for these services. The state government, other state agencies will charge you for that, and that is what they do with that Central Services Cost Allocation Plan, is they come up with how much are they going to bill the DOT for the services they provide, and once you've identified those costs, if you are going to claim indirects, you can actually dump those Central Services costs into your indirect cost pool and get reimbursed through the rate. Since you guys don't claim indirect costs, you're still probably getting billed by those other agencies, but those are going to be costs that you're just paying for with state dollars. So we basically have, technically we have 4 rates. The first 2, provisional and final, are used together, but these are the different ways that you can claim indirect cost. So provisional rate with the final rate, that is usually not used by state DOTs. And the reason why is because what we do on the provisional rate is you look at your estimates, because all of these indirect costs are based on historical numbers. So you're going to look at your historical numbers. You're going to say, okay, we believe, based on our numbers, that we have a 10% rate. That's going to be your provisional rate. Throughout the year, you're going to charge that 10% to your projects or to your direct cost base. And then at the end of the year, you're going to look at your actuals and say, okay, our estimate was that our indirects were going to be 10%, but at the end of the year, you look at your actuals, and let's say they're 12%. So you underbilled by 2%. You have to go back out and touch every single project. It can't just be a one journal entry adjustment. It has to be every single project. You have to go back and touch and make an adjustment for that 2%. And that would be your final rate. So state DOTs don't use a provisional with a final because that would be way too burdensome because you'd have to go out and touch thousands of projects possibly. Small organizations or small LPAs that might only have 1 or 2 projects, that works perfect for them because they actually truly get reimbursed their full indirect costs at the end of the year, and it's easy for them to do those adjustments. So we mostly see provisional with a final used in smaller organizations. Now the final rate, whatever you come up with, the final rate will be your next year's provisional rate. So I'm going to skip predetermined real quick. For the fixed rate, this is what state DOTs use if they want to get reimbursed pretty much the maximum or the total amount of their indirect costs. And it's similar to provisional with final, except for you may have to wait 1 year to get that full reimbursement. The way it would work is, let's use the same example. At the beginning of the year, you use your estimates, and you come up with a 10% rate. You bill that 10% throughout the year. At the end of the year, you look at your actuals and you say, okay, we should have been at 12%. Instead of going back and touching all those past projects, what you're going to do is you're going to carry that 2% forward into the next year. You're going to adjust your next year's rate by that 2%, whether it was an up or a down. You know, if you underbilled, then we're going to adjust it up. If you overbilled, then we're going to adjust your next rates down. And then you bill that next year's rate for that year, and you basically get reimbursed or pay back any kind of overpayment. And it's called a fixed with carry forward, but you do have to wait a whole another year before it actually, you know, gives you what you actually did. And then at the end of that year, you may have to adjust it up or down again. But that's what we see most states use if they want to claim the maximum amount of indirect costs. A predetermined rate, and this is one that they used in Wyoming. This is like in a state where maybe you're not required to have an indirect cost rate, or you're really not too concerned about claiming a lot of indirect costs, but maybe you want to just claim a little bit. A predetermined rate is really good because you only have to do it once every 4 years possibly. So we call this sometimes a negotiated rate. Technically we negotiate all these rates, but a predetermined, let's say your actual based on your estimates is 10% again. We're not going to approve a 10% rate. We're going to negotiate something less, maybe like 8%, and then you don't ever have to adjust it. You don't have to do it every year. You could actually use that 8% for 4 years, up to 4 years, and then 2 CFR 200 actually allows an additional 4-year extension. So technically, you would only have to develop an ICAP once every 8 years, and you don't have to adjust it. So that's why we negotiate down, so there's no risk of the federal government overpaying for indirects, and it's your choice to bill less than what you actually get. So a lot of states that aren't required to get indirects, they'll use a predetermined rate because it's a lot less burdensome. They can do it one time, and then every 4 years we can reevaluate. They could possibly extend it for another 4 years, or maybe after that 4 years, they look at it and say, well, our indirects have went up quite a bit, so we want to renegotiate, and so they'll do another plan. But it's once every 4 years versus a provisional with a final and a fixed rate. That is an every year process, and it takes a long time to develop that. It's very, very cumbersome to do an indirect cost allocation plan. Then we have the new things called de minimis. No state DOTs qualify for de minimis because the requirement for a de minimis is you must receive less than $35 million in direct federal funding, and all of our state DOTs get way more than that. And you can't have ever had a negotiated rate. So if you have a local government, let's say an MPO, because I heard there's some MPOs that have an indirect cost allocation plan, if they've actually negotiated that rate with a federal agency, with a cognizant agency, even if they get less than $35 million, they can never use a de minimis. If they've never negotiated a rate, and this is the first time they're using it, then a de minimis is perfect for them. And basically what a de minimis rate is it's 10% is the rate. They don't have to do any kind of documentation. They don't have to do any kind of supporting documentation, but it's basically 10% of a modified total direct cost base. And unlike these other rates where the state or the local government can kind of choose what their base is, whether it's direct salaries and wages or total direct costs, the modified total direct cost base basically gives you the exact things that you can charge that 10% to. So I'm just going to jump out here so you can see what it says. in 2 CFR 200. So if you go out to 2 CFR 200, and we're just going to go to the definition for modified total direct cost right here. So it's in 200.68. So if you have an entity, a non-federal entity that wants to use a de minimis rate, let me increase the zoom on that so you can read it. What you can charge that 10% to is direct salaries and wages, fringe benefits, materials and supplies, services, which would include professional services like A&E consulting, travel, and up to the first $25,000 of each subaward, which really wouldn't apply here. So basically, salaries and wages, fringe benefits, materials and supplies, services, and travel. That's what your local governments can charge at 10% to. What they cannot charge it to is equipment, capital expenditures, and we've already defined a capital expenditure would be a capital expenditure for right-of-way or for equipment, but it also is contractor payments. Because if you think about our assets out there, the roadways, improving a roadway or improving an asset is a capital expenditure, and so our legal determination is contractor payments would be considered a capital expenditure, and you cannot charge the 10% to contractor payments. So really, there's not a lot that they can charge it to, just salaries and wages, fringe benefits, materials, supplies, services, and travel. And that's what your MPOs, if they want to claim, say, a de minimis rate of 10%, they can, but just make sure that you're monitoring and that they're not charging that to things that are not allowed. And most likely that 10% isn't going to be enough to give them what they expend, what they actually expend in indirects. And so if you're familiar with the consultant side of things, we had a thing called the safe harbor rate, which basically allows consultants, if they want to claim indirect costs, there's a safe harbor rate out there where they don't have to go through the rigmarole of developing this big plan, but the intent of it is to give them an opportunity to claim indirect costs for a couple years so they can have a history, and then they would just develop their own indirect cost allocation. So de minimis can be used indefinitely. They can keep using it as long as they want, but the intent of it is to give them some experience with claiming indirects, and then if they really want to claim what they actually are incurring, they would develop a regular indirect cost allocation plan. So that's new with 2 CFR 200, that de minimis rate. So special rates. If you think about your program, you have a $680 million program, and let's say you have a 10% rate, and you're using total direct cost as your base. If you have a big major project or a big ER event that adds an additional $200 million to your program, you have to exclude those costs from your indirect cost rate, because if you use total direct salaries and wages on your regular program and it's based on what your true indirects are, then most likely you're going to claim what your actual indirects are. But once you start adding $100 or $200 million to your direct cost base, if you continuously apply whatever your rate is to those additional monies, you're going to actually get reimbursed way more in indirect costs than you're actually incurring, and it's going to, you're going to have to pay back those funds, whether it's a carry forward or whatever. So what we always recommend is, if you have a significant event and you're claiming indirect costs, you can create a special rate just for that event or just for certain activities. Just like up here, maybe you have and I don't know if this would happen in Oklahoma, but maybe in some of the other small states like Montana or Wyoming that have a lot of big remote areas, maybe they have to rent a building to support a project for however long that project's going to last, and there's some additional indirect costs that are very specific to that project. You could create a special rate just for that project, and you could bill those indirect costs just for that project. And so that's what that special rate is. We also see that with the LPA program, where some states have used a special rate to allocate costs for just the local public agency, and that happens like in big states like California, where they have like 1,000 or thousands of LPAs that they have to manage, and their staff at the DOT is basically touching 10 or 12 projects a day, and it's very hard for them to track their individual time by each project that they're touching. So they basically develop a narrative allocation methodology to distribute their costs to all of those LPA projects. Also in Arizona, they created a special rate for their big major project. So it wasn't necessarily a project in a remote location, but it was a big major project, $500 million. And if they would have included or charged their regular indirect cost rate to that $500 million, they would have recouped way more than they should have. So they actually created a special rate to charge indirect costs just on that project. And so I've already explained that narrative cost allocation methodology. Mostly all you're going to have for documentation on that is a letter or some documentation that shows what your methodology is going to be. You know, we had this big ER event, like I had mentioned, in Vermont, $10 million, and we had 4 projects. Let's say this one's $2.5 million. If they're all $2.5 million, they're basically all going to get 25% of the indirects. But in that case, they had, you know, $1 million project, a $3 million project, a $2.5 million project, and so each project benefited a little bit differently in the indirects, and that's how they proportionally distributed those indirect costs in that situation. But you can do narratives for any kind of special circumstance, but you cannot do narratives for your entire program. So submitting these indirect cost proposals. So the last bullet there, they have to be submitted within 6 months after the end of your fiscal year. That gives when you submit those, then that gives the federal agency another 6 months to get it reviewed and approved. And so it's almost a year-long process to review and approve these. And the reason why it takes so long is because, you know, you have to come up with a lot of documentation to support the indirect cost allocation. So you have to have your proposal with all of your financial documents, all of your supporting documentation. You have to submit it to the cognizant agency, which would be Federal Highway, and then we would have an additional 6 months to review and approve it. Now, oftentimes, especially in states where they claim indirect costs every year, that process doesn't take as long as it does as we're seeing here. So we, the Federal Highway Administration, sometimes will say, yeah, you don't need to submit it within 6 months. You can have a little bit longer time, or maybe they'll submit it within 3 months, and then we can turn it around in a couple months. So sometimes it doesn't take that long, but I've seen many times where a new financial manager will come into a division office in a state that is very experienced in doing indirect costs, and that new finance person, because they've never ever seen the indirect cost allocation plan, they might need a little bit more time. So I always recommend to new financial managers, hey, if you're going to a state where they claim indirects and you need a little bit more time, then we usually go back to the regulations and say, hey, maybe for this year we understand that you're very, that you know what you're doing, but it gives the Federal Highway Administration a little bit more time to review and approve. So just be aware that there are deadlines, but we're pretty flexible on some of those depending on the state we're in. We've already talked about fringe benefits, but basically what a fringe benefit rate does is it allows you to get reimbursed for those other costs associated with your employees other than just their regular salary or their hourly rate. So all of those extra benefits that we give our employees, like our health benefits and leave and any other types of fringe type of benefits, you can develop a fringe rate or a labor additive rate, and you can bill that. Now, we see a lot of states where they don't develop a fringe or a labor additive rate. They just throw all of those costs in an indirect cost plan, and that's okay too. But like in Oklahoma, since you don't claim indirects, it makes way more sense to develop that labor additive rate, and you can still get reimbursed for those costs while not getting reimbursed for other indirects. Any questions on Subpart E? Okay, let's do a Kahoot. Okay. Okay, I think 30 is about as many as we've had, so here we go. So select the correct composition of cost formula. Yeah. So total cost equals allowable directs plus allocable indirects minus any applicable credits. So because you don't claim indirect costs here, or you don't have an allocation plan, yours would be total cost equals directs minus applicable credits. Because the indirects have to be allocable in order to be included in the formula. All right, Katoot. Katoot is number 1. Break time almost done. T-Rex cat. Okay, an indirect cost is incurred for common or joint purposes benefiting more than one objective. True or false? Yeah, that's true. So an indirect is for common and joint purposes. A direct cost is for a very specific purpose. Ooh, break time knocked out Katoot. And almost done Boo, and the T-Rex kitty is still there. Okay, which of the following rates can be approved for up to 4 years? Yeah, so remember a fixed rate, that's an annual rate. You have to do it every year. A de minimis rate is basically indefinitely. A provisional rate is used with the final rate, and that's every year. But a predetermined, yes, you can do that up to 4 years, and we actually can do an extension for an additional 4. All right, Dwight Schrute's moving up the line. Somebody's an Office fan, because I'm an Office fan. All right, indirect cost proposals must be submitted within how many months after the end of the fiscal year? Yeah. 6 months after the end of the fiscal year is what the regulations require. Okay, here we go. Third place, SDT. T-Rex and the Screaming Kitty. Ooh, like rude.